Yeah, they have to all go out. They'll be grouped together. We got to come up. General Reed's going to jump. Try to break the whole record on Saturday.
What we don't know.
It's crazy.
I'm just going to go someplace there. I'm going to British for me. Oh, damn.
It's Friday, Saturday, and Sunday.
It's, oh, they have it.
This is the annual, but they'll do it again next year.
Mr. Vogel, you are currently unmuted.
You got a lot to it.
Yeah, just to mute.
Hey, Sean and Michael, this is Mary Esther. Are we good, even though we don't have a quorum, to go ahead and get started with the beginning part?
Yeah, that'd be great. We can, if you want to start us off, and then I can cover the agenda while we wait for our quorum.
Okay, perfect. And just to remind anybody that's on the call that hasn't gone to the roll call so that we can make sure we get you counted, we would appreciate it. First of all, I want to welcome everybody to the Transportation Policy Board. I want to let you know that this morning I've asked Mayor Vogel from Robertson County, who's the vice chair, to lead today's meeting. I have a little bit of a conflict that I have to be at 10:30, but I wanted to kind of give you all an update on some of the things today that are so important. We are going to be taking one more step towards the adoption of our new regional transportation plan. Today's agenda is obviously really important. Staff's going to be looking for guidance from all of us on pressing policy matters that are going to help determine which of our projects will be selected for the $10 billion amount of money in federal grants and matching funds that our region is slated for in the upcoming years. What we're wanting input from you on today is the proposed prioritization of our regional goals and the proposed method for setting performance targets for roadway and pedestrian safety across Middle Tennessee. Staff's also prepared a presentation on the issue of social equity and inclusion. And as we look to ensure that the transportation plan does its part that to ensure shared prosperity and equality across the board in access to jobs and education. So as I hand over the gavel to Mayor Vogel to call the meeting to order, I just want to remind everybody what's at stake. Our participation in this process will be the determining factor in the plan's success, and a successful regional plan must represent our collective vision from all of us within our region for it to be mutually beneficial. I want to thank you all for taking the time to be on the call today. I know you all know how important all of this is. I just wanted to reiterate it and apologize for not being at the meeting the entire time, but I know Mayor Vogel's going to do a great job. So Mayor Vogel, I will turn it over to you. And, you know, I hope maybe next time we might even be seeing each other in person. So best of wishes to all of you.
Mayor Vogel, I think you're on mute. There you go. And I think Mayor Reed did a great job of covering the agenda as well. So I think we are still waiting on a quorum. Is that correct, Lou?
Yes, we still lack 3.
We we can move to the informational items and come back to the action items if that's okay.
Hey, thank you, Sean. That'll be fine with the with Chair Vogel.
Mayor Vogel, if you just unmute yourself and then we can.
Says unmute.
There we go.
Okay, if you, Sean, if you'd like, we just move down to item 4 till we get a quorum. You know, the plan update and information, and I'm gonna turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. Appreciate that. So I know we'll go a little bit out of order today, but one of the informational items that we have today is a update on the regional transportation plan, one of many updates on the RTP. And with this item, we really wanted to provide an update on the process that staff's going through, overview of the evaluation process, and some of the tools that we're utilizing to evaluate those projects that have come in to the call for projects, projects submitted by TDOT, local jurisdictions, as well as the transit agencies. And so over the past couple months, we've presented on existing conditions and trends across a variety of topics, you know, stemming back to the spring, presenting on growth as areas that were anticipated to grow based on households or population and jobs. Also presented on congestion of roadways that are expected to become increasingly congested over time, you know, based on speeds or where volumes exceed capacity. We also presented to you in July on safety, identifying areas where there was, you know, greater number of crashes, as well as areas with more severe crashes throughout the region. Last month, you heard on the environment and areas where there are environmentally sensitive areas. And then this month, you'll hear, we intended to get to this last month, but we ran a little bit over on time. You'll be hearing about social equity in some of the areas where vulnerable populations reside within the region, and specifically where some of those highly vulnerable areas are within the region, which we'll speak about for later in the meeting. And so a lot of this data has been presented at the regional level to you, and what we've done over the past couple months is translate that into the project level. And so we really received a lot of updates from your staff through round 1 workshops that we held with each county to confirm a lot of the details on projects, termini and alignment, in order to tag a lot of these data indicators that we present at a regional level to specific projects, and so in order to evaluate those at the project level. And so a lot of that information, which we refer to as some of these quantitative project level indicators, we've brought a lot of that data and analysis to the project level, and that's really to focus our efforts on evaluating and prioritizing those candidate projects. And so I'll turn it to, I want to demo kind of where we keep that information and where we've housed that. And so I'm going to pull up our project database, which we call the Apply app. And this is the database where project proponents have submitted their project needs. You can log in if you have a username and password. We also have a publicly available username and password for those that are interested that don't have an account yet. But you'll see all the projects that we were able to map from the 350 projects that we received through the call for projects. And you can sort through them. You can search by project type or county or the project ID. You can filter the list by county, as well as the horizon that the proponent indicated the project would be completed by, and then project type or even cost. And so This is a really useful tool, and what I will do is highlight, once you go to a specific project, let's pick this one that we're going to highlight, which is State Route 96 widening from 840 in Williamson County to Veterans Boulevard in Rutherford County. And once you click on this view project, it already signed me out. Here. So once you get to the project form is where you can see the information that proponents have provided. It includes a lot of these sections at the top: project description, purpose and need, project history, costs, funding, timing, and then proposed improvements associated with the project. And then when you get to these sections beneath is where staff has populated a lot of this project level data, and it includes a lot of indicators and performance measures that relate to a lot of the goal areas that we will discuss today, is congestion and system preservation, safety. And so within this, you'll see a lot of information that can help us assess the needs, transportation needs within that project area, and how they relate to some of the other candidate projects that are under consideration. And so staff utilizes a number of these indicators through the project evaluation process, and we'll talk a little bit more about that using some examples. And then in addition to these project level indicators, staff also looks at a number of staff analysis questions, and those are relying on the indicators as well, but taking a closer look at let me just go back to the slides here. Taking a closer look at the evaluation of those transportation problems and needs, reviewing those proposed improvements and assessing the impact of them. And then also lastly, to identify opportunities to enhance the project. And so we'll go through a couple of examples. Ben Grambling and myself will highlight two different aspects of the staff analysis for one project, focusing on congestion as well as environment. And so the example that we're going to use is the State Route 96 widening that I mentioned. And within staff's version of the application, when you log in, the questions that we will be considering are actually contained within the database. And that's what we're going to highlight here for you now. So when it comes to congestion, staff analysis questions, we have 4 of them related to congestion, although there are some other questions and data that gets at congestion, given its relationship to safety and some of the other topics. But the questions that we look at are: to what extent is this project located in an area with reoccurring traffic congestion? And then staff's response to that is on a sliding scale of 1 star to 5 stars, depending on if it's located in an area with no congestion or little congestion to significant or severe congestion. Also, are there identifiable causes of reoccurring congestion in the area? And then this is one where we can identify a couple of those potential causes within this area. And then, does this project address known traffic congestion? And this gets more at the proposed improvements. Are they addressing some of those causes that have been identified? And then lastly, can the project scope be modified to help manage current or future traffic congestion? And this is where we'd have an opportunity to highlight some of the strategies that might not be proposed as part of the project's improvements. And this one in particular for congestion relates very closely to the toolbox of strategies that we've talked about in the past. through the CMP update process. So this is just a snapshot of the database. I showed you some of the sections, purpose and need, so kind of an explanation of the project's needs and what's being proposed to address that. And then some of those indicators that we're looking at related to congestion. And so if it's congested, now, or if it's proposed to be congested in the future, if the existing conditions or existing speeds are significantly lower than the free flow speed, and how those are projected to change in the future. Also, if the volumes exceed capacity within the project area, and then also looking at some of the other factors like the level of freight intensity or the prevalence of trucks within the project area, how many intersections per mile, so the intersection density within the area. And then lastly, the prevalence of crashes. So is it in a high crash area, and is it, the top 25 or top 10 or top 5%? So in addition to relying on the Apply app, our data team has been great in developing some supplemental tools to support the evaluation process. And so this is the project evaluation tool, specifically with some of the information related to congestion. And so when we look at that State Route 96 widening project, which is 2860 here, you get to look at the project in consideration in relationship to some of the other projects that are proposed. But then you can look at it based on some of the congested links, outputs from the model. And so you can see that it's definitely meeting those congestion thresholds that we identified almost entirely throughout the corridor. And then also in consideration, where are those high crash locations within the corridor? The project app provides the kind of guidance on where the crash locations might be the worst, but then this indicates kind of how frequent they are or their specific location within the project corridor. And then another consideration is we have the opportunity to pull in kind of the active transportation modes or alternative modes that are being considered. And so, current conditions within that project area, no sidewalks, no transit service, and no transit stops within the immediate vicinity. And so relying on that information is how we pull together kind of our staff response of relying on some of that information in those tools. And so for the first question, we indicated 3 stars for this. Project is located in an area with moderate traffic congestion. And we based that on that percent of free flow speed being below that congested threshold of 0.7. The volume to capacity ratio is approaching 1, which would be our threshold for considering it congested. And then we've also looked at, I didn't use this example, but we've been looking at some observed travel speeds as well through a dashboard, which in this case was in alignment with what the model results indicated. And then existing traffic volumes within the area, so kind of how many people are being impacted by the congestion, how many vehicles. Current traffic volumes are about 10,000 and that's about average based on its functional classification, but they're expected to increase to nearly 29,000 by 2045. So a lot of future demand. And then are there identifiable causes of reoccurring congestion? So the project is located in a high crash area, which we identified. The freight intensity was above average for its functional class, and then the also identified the poor access management and lack of turning lanes along the corridor, along the existing corridor. And then does this project address known traffic congestion? So the project is going from 2 to 5 lanes, so it does increase roadway capacity to meet current and future traffic volumes, which would also help to identify to address safety by correcting some of the roadway deficiencies and enhancing access with the addition of turning lanes. And then lastly, can the project scope be modified to help manage current or future traffic congestion? And so this is where we had the opportunity to consider some of the other strategies, which I identified as access management improvements to preserve that capacity that's added. This could be through the incorporation of a median, and also would have safety benefits. Also considering a greenway or a multi-use path along this corridor, given the number of travel lanes to support that shift to alternative modes within the project area. And so this is an example for congestion, and staff is working very hard to go through this same process for 350 projects. And so it's a very rigorous process to go through, and so we hope to wrap this up before the end of the month. And so with that, I will turn it over to Ben, and he's going to do a quick walkthrough of similar approach, but from the environmental lens.
Yeah, hi, Sean. Thank you. Hopefully you can hear me all right. And just before I dive into the environmental analysis, I just bring to your attention, there's a comment or a question from Faye in the chat box. Maybe after I get through my slides, you can come back to that and address that along with any other questions that folks may have about this segment of the meeting. Good morning, everybody. Happy to be with you again. Again, Ben Gramling, Environmental Planning Manager with GNRC. For those of you who were able to participate in last month's TPB meeting, this will be a nice segue into how we took a lot of the information and data we presented to you last month directly into that project level analysis that we spoke about last month. And here on the screen are the 6 qualitative staff analysis questions that I am answering for each of those projects that have come in through the call for projects as part of this RTP update. You might recall from last month's presentation our description of environmentally sensitive areas, which is a geospatial layer that we create as a composite that actually brings together, I think it's 9 different explicit data sets from a number of different sources that allow us to evaluate how the project, the proposed transportation project, may interact with environmental conditions in its proximity as it moves forward through the development process. We also have an additional set of environmental factors, which we refer to as additional environmental factors. It's another 8 data sets that we look at in comparison to the proposed transportation project. We evaluate from staff perspective how significant the potential impact is to those areas. And if you'll recall, we also work to characterize how much the environmental conditions may present a challenge to the transportation project itself. So that's a two-way street where a project may impact the environment in which it's located, but environmental conditions, whether it's a stream crossing or a floodplain area or steep slopes, may make it more difficult or complex for that project to move forward through the design development process. So we work to describe what kind of challenges those may be as the project goes forward. And then we also flag whether or not we think there might be an environmental fatal flaw associated with the project that would cause some substantial problem for the project as it moves forward. And I'm sorry, I think I jumped over question number 4. Once we characterize the potential environmental impact, we then provide some qualitative feedback back to the project applicant that will hopefully bring more information to them so that they can better incorporate environmental information into the decision-making process related to the project as it moves forward. So using that same project that Sean walked through a moment ago, if we move to the next slide, I'll show you just exactly how that plays out. So here is that Highway 96 project just south of the 840 corridor there, and what's mapped here in green is that composite environmentally sensitive areas layer. It's all of those 9 different data sets compressed into one geospatial layer, and in this particular case, not all 9 of those data sets are implicated in this particular project. I think there are four different specific data sets that intersect with this project along its length running from east to west. But the overall overlap of the ESA is characterized as well. So if we move to the next slide, I think we'll go through those different explicit data layers that are implicated by this project. The first one, slide may be lagging on my end. I've still got the ESA up. There we go. The prime agricultural soils are shown here in light green. These are agricultural soils determined by the U.S. Department of Agriculture as being of high quality in order to sustain agricultural, growing agricultural operations going forward. The next slide shows the intersection between the project and what are referred to as priority habitat areas, high and very high priority habitat areas, in this case as determined by the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency. The next slide shows the relationship between the proposed project and surface water bodies, and you can pick up here that there are 3 explicit crossings of streams along the project corridor length. And lastly, we show the distribution of wetlands in the vicinity. They're harder to pick up on the screen here. They're look like small dots or pockmarks across the landscape here, but we characterize the potential intersection between the project footprint and wetlands. And then lastly, we are able to characterize the overlap between the project and those additional environmental factors, which are mapped here in the pink color. And I believe in this project's case, a majority of this overlap with additional environmental factors is triggered by the presence of climate resilient lands as described by the Nature Conservancy, who was able to provide us with some really valuable data around habitat areas that would be resilient into the future given potential climate uncertainty into the future. And with that quantitative analysis, that overlap between the project and those different data sets, we're able to then characterize for each project our answers to those questions that I walked through. And I'll zero in right now on question 3 and question 4, both the potential significance of the environmental impact that this project may have and what might be done about that as this project moves forward. And so for this particular project, given the length of the proposed project and the fact that it's looking to convert a 2-lane highway to potentially 5 lanes, there's significant new capacity and roadway footprint that would be developed through this project. And taking that impact along with the surrounding landscapes, we think that there's significant potential for both direct and indirect environmental impacts, not just because of the roadway itself, but because of the likely triggering of land use changes that may take place in the project vicinity. And our encouragement back to the project sponsor on this project would be to really engage in a thorough environmental analysis with community environmental stakeholder engagement as the project moves forward in order to ensure that as much of that potential environmental impact can be understood from as early in the project process as possible, and steps can be taken as best as possible to reduce that potential environmental impact. And with that, I think I'll turn it back to Sean and can answer any questions that folks may have about this segment, or Sean, you can field questions as you wish.
I think there's a couple of questions in the chat box. I was struggling to kind of advance slides and respond, but I think just to respond to Sean's question regarding the CMP toolbox, yes, we're drawing on the CMP toolbox for those scope modifications considerations, and we hope to share those with the project proponents. We're aiming for a second September workshop with the TCC members at the end of the month. Looking to schedule that for September 30th, and so the hope would be to then plan to share those as part of that workshop. And then I think there was one other comment in there about modifications incorporated into the project evaluation. And so the staff analysis component factors into the overall scoring methodology. And so that will be able to go through the initial results of that as well at the workshop. And then responding to Faye, your comment about the project progress, including the design and construction, probably where that's best tracked right now is through the TIP application, the interactive TIP database. Anna can speak more to that, but that's the short-term capital plan of the TIP is where we probably get into more detail on the phases of work and the programming associated with each of those components as a project advances through the project development process. The Apply app has primarily been reserved for the RTP call for projects and evaluation approach to date.
Okay, does anyone else have any questions for Sean and his staff? Hearing none, I'd just like to remind everybody that the evaluation results will be presented at a workshop, as Sean said, at the end of the month. Sean, you want to jump back now and let's go back to the minutes and start over? I understand we got to have a quorum.
That works for me.
Okay, let's go back to the start, gang, and I'll entertain a motion to approve the minutes of the 8/19/2020 minutes.
So moved, Mr. Chairman.
Got a motion by Mayor Hope. Need a second. Got a second.
Mayor Hutto.
Mayor Hope, thank you. I just want to remind anybody that if you have a abstain or you're voting nay, to state your name and so for the record. And of course, this has all been recorded. All for the motion being approved, say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Any nays? Let the record show that the minutes are approved. Okay, we'll move down to our public comments. Is there anyone that would like to make a comment? Okay, I don't hear anyone, so we'll move on down to our action items. And then, of course, we're going to have amending the TP 2006 to the TIP. And I'm going to introduce Anna. Would you take that and carry it forward?
I'd be happy to, Mayor Vogel. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. This is the second time this body will have reviewed the current slate of proposed amendments to the fiscal year 2020 to 2023 TIP. This is our final cycle of amendments for the current federal fiscal year 2020. We reviewed the majority of these amendments together at our last meeting in August. And so I'm not going to walk through each of these one by one this time around, but I do want to call your attention to the final two amendments listed there in your agenda package. The first of those being a request from TDOT for their State Route 99 Widening Segment 1 project. This is from I-24 to State Route 96. The request is to add $1 million in highway improvement program funds to this project that will go towards the project's construction. The next new addition is requested from the City of Mount Juliet, and it's for their Cedar Creek Greenway Phase 1 project. They're adding a line for local funding to this project that is going to complete the construction budget for this project. So I did just want to call out those two new additions. I'm certainly happy to take any questions anyone might have about the new projects or any of the projects above those on the list of proposed amendments here.
Okay, thank you. And of course, anybody in the public or any gang, you got some questions you need to ask? Hearing none, I'll entertain a motion to put amendment on the Transportation Improvement Program.
One comment on this one, Mayor Vogel. we, according to our public participation plan, we have to hold a public hearing as well with the TIP amendment.
Okay, anyone from the public like to address this? Okay, hearing none, I'll ask for a motion to amend the transportation improvement program.
More here. I move approval.
Guys need a second?
Second, Mayor Holt.
Okay, thank you. All in favor, say aye.
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 Does anyone oppose? Let the record show the amendment passes. Thank you, gang. You're probably going to hear me say amend the budget a lot. We do a lot of that in Robertson County. We do a lot of amending the budget. Okay, we went to the informational items on number 4. Sean, do we need to go back to that, or you want to move on?
The last action item we have is the endorsed updates to the RTP policy framework.
Okay, I see it now. Yes, it was on another page. Yeah, go ahead and take off, Sean.
All right. Good morning again. So this item will present proposed updates to the policy framework, and that's mainly to include recommended weights for each of the goals based on a pairwise activity that we conducted with both the TCC members and the Transportation Policy Board members. And these weights are important because they're going to be used as part of that evaluation process to prioritize transportation needs for funding through the RTP. And, we endorsed the latest updates to the policy framework back in January, and that established a number of the goals for the region, along with objectives and performance measures to gauge progress towards some of the desired outcomes that we identified. But we also recognize that certain goals are more important to you than others, and we wanted to give you an opportunity for some of those goals to have greater consideration in the evaluation and prioritization process. So staff conducted a pairwise activity with the TCC and TPB, as I mentioned, and that was to determine the relative importance of these 6 goals. And so just a refresher on those goals that we've established within the policy framework. They are to maintain state of good repair for roadways, bridges, and transit systems, to improve safety for the traveling public and freight haulers, mitigate congestion to keep the region moving, increase access to economic opportunity for all Middle Tennesseans, minimize disruptive impacts of transportation systems and improvements, and align with other local, regional, and statewide policies and plans. And so the opportunity to indicate those preferences we made through this pairwise exercise through Decision Lens. And the way that it was laid out is you had the opportunity to, this screen on the right indicates kind of what you would see as you went through that pairwise exercise, which basically gave you an opportunity to indicate, if a goal was of greater importance to you than another. So in this screenshot, it's, is maintain state of good repair more important than improve safety. And then you have the opportunity to move the slider scale to, to what degree you think that it is more important or less important. And so through that exercise, we got results, and we will showcase kind of the technical TCC results, as well as the more policy results from the Transportation Policy Board. But we'll highlight how there's a lot of consensus. And so results of the TCC, the ranking order was, safety was by far a clear top priority. And then that was followed by maintain state of good repair, followed by mitigate congestion, increase access to economic opportunity, minimize disruptive impacts, and align with policies and plans. And to compare that with the Transportation Policy Board results, the first 4 goals were very similar and all in the same order, and then the only difference was the switch between align with policies and plans and minimize disruptive impacts. Those were opposite of the TCC results. And so what we did was, highlight that consensus across the stakeholders where the top 4 goals were the same, and then just a slight variation in the bottom 2. And what we did with that is, given the strong alignment, staff rounded the percentages to the nearest 5% for each goal. And what we're proposing for the goal weights is on the far right column, the staff recommendation, which would consist of improve safety at 30%, maintain state of good repair at 20%, mitigate congestion at 15%, increase access to economic opportunity at 15%, minimize disruptive impacts at 10%, and align with policies and plans at 10%. And those percentages would indicate the percentage of the overall score that goal factored into the overall score, its weight. And so today we'll be looking for your endorsement of these goal weights, and that way we can fold them into the evaluation approach and to guide our prioritization of projects.
Thank you, Sean. Looked like we was all on top of that improved safety and keep everything in good repair. I'm going to ask for a motion. If you have any more, if no one has any questions, ask for a motion to endorse this update of the policy framework.
Endorsed with great enthusiasm.
I
give a second.
I got a second from Mayor Hutto. Again, all in favor say aye.
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 Anyone opposed, say no. Nay. Okay, let the record show that motion passes for the endorsement. Thank you, Sean. And of course, we've already been over the informational items, and I want to thank Sean and Ben for the work they've done on that. And if we will, we'll move down to B, the social equity analysis for the RTP. I'm going to introduce Shelley.
Thank you, Mayor. As Sean has mentioned, we're developing a brief in support of the UTP that explores equity in the region to really ensure that we can make decisions that are informed and help make the region a more equitable place to live. As part of the process of developing the brief, we've reviewed the efforts of our peer regions and I think developed a strategy that really pulls the best practices from those regions. This presentation is an overview of the brief. It's going to outline kind of the touch on the big elements that are listed here. There are, next slide, I think, Sean. There are numerous reasons for us to be concerned about equity in the region. You know, we all want to ensure that all residents have access to jobs and education and healthcare and recreation, and of course, transportation. But of course, we have a lot of important challenges. The region is growing and aging and diversifying. Our transportation access is just not equitable across the region. And there are just a lot of transportation. There are not a lot of transportation options available to people, especially those that are the most vulnerable. And even if we do have those transportation options, they're often unsafe and unreliable. I think the next slide, we're going to talk through a few more challenges. Really, the cost of living in the region, as we all know, is really increasing, especially housing costs. People are living further and further away from their jobs, and without a lot of good transportation options to connect them. It's especially impacting low wage earners. And then, of course, right now, we're facing COVID, which is disproportionately affecting the most vulnerable populations. There are several federal regulations that require us to consider equity in our planning process. These are the four most central requirements and regulations. We got the Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, We've got executive orders that focus on environmental justice and limited English proficiency, and of course the ADA Act. Building on those federal regulations and other guidance from the federal government, we've identified 9 vulnerable populations. And again, we identified these really looking at our peer regions, what other MPOs and all have included in their analysis. And we've come up with these 9. The next slide kind of is a chart that shows you how those 9 align with the federal requirements that we just talked about. We've added in 4 additional to the federal requirements: the seniors, unemployed, single mother households, and the carless. You know, all of these groups have physical, economic, or mobility issues that make them especially vulnerable. You know, for example, seniors often have physical issues that prevent them from driving. Single mother households are home to the most vulnerable children, the most vulnerable to poverty. And carlessness is a significant hindrance to mobility and access to opportunity, especially in our region where we have such a sprawling development pattern and a lack of good public transportation. So those are the 9 categories we've looked at. I'm going to turn things over to Carson. She's going to walk you through all the data that she's pulled together and some of the analysis that we've done. So Carson?
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So hi, I'm Carson Cooper. I'm a research analyst. I've presented, I think, once before to TPB, but I am newer to GNRC. And I'm just going to dig into the data. So from those 9 populations, we identified the proportion of those populations across the region. So 12% of the region are 65 or older, 24% are non-white. And these averages or these percentages will come into play later with our methodology of identifying if something is highly vulnerable when we compare it back to the region total or the regional average. And because we were comparing our methodology and kind of creating it compared to peer MPOs, we also wanted to see how our population compares to peer MPOs. So Nashville is in orange, and we compared to 9 other MPOs of comparative size in population or area, and they're all in the blue and gray colors. So compared to peer MPOs for the most recent year of data available, which is 2018, we have comparable or lower percentages of these vulnerable populations, and we're not the highest in any single population. But what's really interesting to see is the change in these populations over time. So on the next slide, we can see the change in these vulnerable populations since 2010 in our region alone. So a very large increase in seniors, and the total population in between these 2 years only increased by 16%. So a lot of these vulnerable populations are outpacing that growth if they're over 16%. And I wanted to point out that unemployment decreased because 2010 was just after the recession. So we want to see a larger decrease in that variable. So on the next slide, we also compared the change in each of these populations to our peer MPOs, and it shows a more dramatic trend. So Nashville has seen relatively high growth in many of the vulnerable populations. Total population-wise, we are the 3rd fastest growing behind Austin and Charlotte. But the most dramatic ones were that we saw the highest increase in limited English households, equal with Memphis, and the highest increase in disabled populations, equal with Charlotte. But for many of these variables, we were the 3rd highest or 4th highest in growth in these populations. So not only is our region, you know, pretty vulnerable or comparably vulnerable, but we're increasing in vulnerability over time. Just going to clarify some of the terms I'm going to be throwing around for the rest of the presentation. Degrees of vulnerability is this index that we created of these 9 vulnerable populations. And it is considered a vulnerable area if that area or block group in this case has a vulnerable population above the regional average. And we look at that for each of the 9. So it'll get a point if it is above the regional average for, say, seniors. It'll get an additional point if it's above the regional average for non-white, and so on and so forth. And then we really wanted to identify hotspots. So highly vulnerable areas, or you might hear me say HVA, is an area with 6 or more degrees of vulnerability. So at least 6 of those populations are above the regional average. So the next slide, I just want to highlight that we were comparing the proportion of the population to the average across the region, not the number. So if the block group's proportion is higher than the regional average, it receives a point. So the orange areas represent all of the block groups where the percent of seniors is higher than the percent of seniors across the whole region, or that 12%. So it's important to evaluate the proportion or the percent instead of the number, because obviously certain areas, especially Davidson County, are they could be skewed by density. So the dots on this map are showing the number of seniors themselves, which is more dense in urban areas, but the orange represents where that is a higher average concentration, which are pretty dispersed throughout the region. And altogether, these orange areas represent over half of all of the seniors in the region. And this will continue with other maps, so you can kind of see the dispersion of the above average areas. So looking at racial minorities or the non-white population, it's definitely more concentrated in core urban areas, definitely within Davidson County, and it's more consistent with the density of that population, which are the blue dots. And about 3/4 of the entire region's minorities are represented just in these orange areas. Similar to racial minority, the ethnic minority population or the Hispanic Latino population is more concentrated in certain areas and more consistent with density. And again, 3/4 of this, the whole Hispanic population is represented just in these orange areas. The disabled population, similar to seniors, is more dispersed throughout the entire region. There's often a correlation between age and disability, as well as, we're trying to have people age in place. But more of the population actually the high concentrations are living in the surrounding counties around Davidson, or in that North Davidson kind of area. Single mother households are pretty dispersed throughout the region, and we evaluate this population because it's a single income household and women are a protected class, so it's more difficult to care for children and it's more vulnerable to unequal wages or cost of living increases. We have talked about internally possibly changing this variable in the future to being single parents and adding an additional 10th population of females alone, just as a way to make it more even. So there's 10 populations, but this dispersion kind of skews things, I think, later on, but it's only one population. Interestingly, there are quite a few concentrations of carless households in the surrounding counties, not just in Davidson, where it's more walkable, meaning these people have a harder time commuting to work downtown or getting around the region or outside the region. And there are about 30,000 carless households in our MPO region, and 23,000 of those are represented in these orange areas. Limited English households are very concentrated in specific areas of the region, and these areas represent 90% of all limited English households in the region, which is much higher than any of the other populations. Unemployment is also pretty scattered throughout the region, and 3/4 of the unemployed population are represented by these orange areas. And I want to note that there is more recent unemployment data available through other sources, but this is the ACS value from that 2018 estimate, which is the most up-to-date ACS variable. Obviously, with the impacts of coronavirus, their unemployment is probably looking very different right now. And finally, poverty is also pretty scattered throughout the region, with the exception of Williamson County. There's not many pockets of high concentrations of poverty, and 3/4 of all of the families in poverty are represented just in these orange areas. So all of those populations and areas that we just went through and evaluated are shown here in a composite. So anything orange received a single point for that population, and can therefore score anywhere from 0 to 9, being the most vulnerable as it is a higher than average concentration of all of those populations. And on the next slide, we identified highly vulnerable areas, or HVAs, which is anything that scored a 6 groups or higher. And 20% of all of the region's block groups had this higher score. So it helps us evaluate vulnerable hotspots. And then we kind of clustered these highly vulnerable areas into 21 geographies. So this isn't to say that this is, the city of Lebanon or the city of Springfield, but it is block groups that align with that geography pretty closely. So we lumped them together either by neighborhood within Davidson County or by the surrounding city, and therefore created these kind of areas that help us evaluate the context of their geography a little better. And so again, just highlighting that we're evaluating proportions of these populations. So in the case of each population, which with the exception of seniors, which are the most dispersed, the proportion of these populations are higher in highly vulnerable areas than the MPO region, which is kind of the point we're trying to identify the most concentrated areas of these. So while 24% of the region is non-white, for example, half of the population in the highly vulnerable areas are non-white. So they're being disproportionately represented in these highly vulnerable hotspots. And we can also compare the change that occurred in these areas versus the region since 2010. The region is higher for a lot of these bar changes, the orange or the blue bars, because the raw numbers are higher. So like the region as a whole grew more than these smaller representative areas. But for both the region and the highly vulnerable areas, almost all of these populations are increasing. And what's really interesting to note are the light orange boxes that I've highlighted, which show the representative change occurring in these highly vulnerable areas. So while the region as a whole increased in its non-white population by 21%, a third of that 21% occurred just in these highly vulnerable areas. Another dramatic figure, 40% of the increase in limited English households occurred in these areas. Half of the increase in poverty occurred in these areas. And another one to note is we want that larger decrease in unemployment, as I said earlier, following the recession. So the region has actually recovered pretty well, unemployment decreasing about 30%. But in contrast, these highly vulnerable areas decreased only about 6%. So they're still kind of recovering from the recession. So now we're going to go more into not just the raw, demographics, but looking at how all of these play into our existing infrastructure and access. So the next map shows where the jobs are, where people who live in these highly vulnerable areas or the gray areas work. The yellow area downtown shows a higher concentration of people commuting there. So many of them have to commute downtown, even from areas as far as, Mount Pleasant. And while the highly vulnerable areas represent 17% of the region's population, they only hold 9% of the jobs in the region. So they may be having to commute outside of the MPO, which, could create even further commutes. So it's just something to look at. And this is that same map shown in relation to transit stops. Important to note that being in proximity to a transit stop doesn't mean that the route serves where you need to go or, is frequent enough for you to get where you need to go. But it's interesting to note that over half of the jobs held by the highly vulnerable residents are within a half mile to a transit stop. And we wanted to dig a bit further into commute times and patterns. So this shows the roadway travel time bands of the PM or afternoon commute from downtown across the region in a car. So the average commute time across the MPO is 27 minutes. So we used 30 minutes as kind of a reasonable commute time. All of Davidson and these interstate spokes are within that 30-minute commute, and all but 6 of the highly vulnerable areas are within 30 minutes of downtown by a car. But when we look at that in contrast with travel time bands for transit, it dramatically decreases. So many of these highly vulnerable areas have high concentrations of carless households and likely rely on transit. However, transit service may not even reach them, or it may create a commute upwards of 2 hours. And just want to note that these transit travel times include fixed route services for MTA, WeGo, RTA, and express services, but it does not include paratransit services that are offered in Davidson County. And the travel times include the average headway, or the amount of time you wait for the bus, but it does not include any transfer times. So if you have to take multiple routes, it doesn't account for that. So then we wanted to look at the actual density of infrastructure, and many of the highly vulnerable areas have a relatively high transit stop density, especially concentrated to those urban core areas such as East Nashville, North Nashville, and like the 440 kind of band. It was a similar trend for sidewalks, bike lanes, greenways, and trails. So in summary, the top 3 of each density are bolded and shows that these closer urban core areas, vulnerable areas, are actually relatively well served by the density of infrastructure itself. So it's kind of like helping us point out that maybe some other factors are going on that are creating barriers to access, such as the service frequency or reliability, the infrastructure condition or design, or the cost of transportation. So we looked at the transit route distribution across the region, as well as high frequency routes. And headway, as I said before, is the amount of time you are waiting for the next bus. And we identified high frequency being a 15 to 20 minute headway, or 3 to 4 buses per hour. So across the region, the average headway is about 42 minutes. Which is, relatively high, but that's including our express services that are only offered certain times of the day. But thus, it's crucial that services are on schedule, or it may affect someone's trip by upwards of an hour. So we wanted to start looking at how some of these trip variables possibly correlate with each other. So here, the vertical axis is the percent of households without cars, and the horizontal axis is the percent of workers with a commute under 30 minutes, or that short commute, as we said before. And we used the MPO average in that orange dot as kind of a threshold. And it's very interesting that most of these highly vulnerable areas are above average for both variables, with no correlation based on their geography. Urban, rural, they're almost all of them are above the MPO average. And that isn't to say that the transit or other mode that they use to get to work is a short commute, because many of these areas are above average for workers with a short commute. But it may actually give an indication that that short commute is out of necessity, that they're limited to close proximity jobs and not higher paying jobs downtown or in other areas, because they're limited with their transportation choices by transit routes, or they are carless, or not even just the route, but if the route takes too long to get to downtown, they're probably going to pick a job that's closer. So again, out of that necessity, this shows the average lowest headway for each highly vulnerable area in comparison to those carless households. So again, interesting that almost all these highly vulnerable areas are above average for the amount of time that they wait for a bus, while also being the ones in most need of transit. Even areas that are closer to downtown, like East Nashville, that we think is being pretty well served by transit, has a really high headway time of almost an hour. So noting that the previous slide for commute time doesn't include the amount of time you wait for the bus, it was just the bus trip time from the census. So while you may have a larger share of these workers that have a short actual trip time, their overall commute can be upwards of an hour and a half when you include the headway and transfer times. So, if you miss the bus, there's no way of getting to work on time. So it really affects, your access to jobs, especially if you're using transit. And again, cost is definitely a factor. And with housing affordability becoming an issue in Nashville, it's important to see how that's affecting people's transportation choices as well. So here's the housing and transportation costs together as a percent of median income. So the regional average is 44%. You're going to be spending about 44, almost half your income on just living, getting around and living. So while these highly vulnerable areas may not actually spend a large amount on housing and transportation compared to other areas, they are spending a disproportionately higher proportion of their income, even if they have a lower income. So even areas that are closer proximity, such as North Nashville, are disproportionately affected by costs, spending upwards of 80% of their income just to live. So this is that same data broken out into a chart by monthly cost. And you can really see the difference in disposable income between the bars and dots of each of these areas, with the one all the way to the right being Williamson County, not the highly vulnerable areas, but the county as a whole. So it's really interesting to see these dramatic differences as costs all the way to Williamson County, which has much more, room to spend. So then we also evaluated how safety is playing out in these highly vulnerable areas. So you've seen this map before in the safety presentations, but all crashes and those highly vulnerable areas are gray. They might be kind of hard to see, but it's no surprise that choke points and interstates have the most crashes. But the really interesting takeaway with how these relate to the highly vulnerable areas is that crashes of all types are disproportionately occurring in highly vulnerable areas when compared to their representative population in the region, which is 17%, or their representative area, which is only 6%. Non-motorized crashes are especially disproportionately represented in the highly vulnerable areas. 30% of all non-motorized crashes are happening in these areas, and that's probably because there are more non-motorized users if they're carless or using transit. So it's really interesting to see this trend, especially that these areas are definitely unsafe, and it's something that we need to focus on because these are very vulnerable classes. And so here is a map of a similar analysis done by a company called My Sidewalk, and they did it for the CBSA area, which the counties are a little different. But they did an economic vulnerability indicator, which they developed with COVID specifically in mind as a way to target populations that were more sensitive to the impacts of the virus. And this is their output. So it's interesting that a lot of their clusters of kind of red hotspots really align with our highly vulnerable areas, even though we used different inputs. We're currently working with them to customize it to our region's counties, but it's interesting to see that they did the same analysis not only for where people live, but where they work. And being an economic indicator, they did more workplace, wage, and industry analysis. So that will inform us as we continue looking at equity in the region, because we know that the impacts of COVID are ongoing and difficult to measure, but seeing how vulnerable these areas were before the virus definitely proves that they are probably experiencing a disproportionate impact from the virus. 49% of workers in the highly vulnerable areas are in essential occupations, which is higher than the average for the region. Transit ridership has definitely decreased, and routes have been kind of unstable, so that's affecting commute times, and several populations are at higher risk of contracting COVID because of age or because of lack of access to healthcare. So that was a lot of data to digest, but I hope that it was informative, and I'll turn it back to Shelley.
Thanks, Carson. We thought we would just kind of circle back and remind everyone like why we're talking about this topic, to think again about how we're growing, aging, and diversifying, that we have a lack of transportation outcomes. I think you can see that they're just not equally distributed across the region. And as Carson pointed out, we have we might have multimodal infrastructure, but often it's unsafe and unreliable. There's still a lot of exploration we want to do around this topic. And I'm sure you all have a lot of suggestions on things that we could include in this analysis. I think the next slide, but we do have a few recommendations that we think will be coming out of this analysis. And that's going to be that we really prioritize equity and access to opportunity in all the decision making, that we look to improve and expand the transit system, especially looking at even, where the transit is there, just increasing the frequency and the reliability of it. That we look at things like implementing complete streets and other ways that we can enhance safety and mobility for pedestrians and non-motorized users, and that we really ensure that we're doing good outreach and engagement with the communities around these planning efforts. So I don't know if there are any questions, if we have time for that, or suggestions that you have for things that we should be looking at in the future. Oh, and finally, you can also find a lot of this data on our dashboard.
Okay, is there any questions for Carson or Shelley? Hearing none. Hey, thank y'all. That's a lot of information, Of course,
fire codes there, I know.
It says y'all are going to work to compile this information into policy briefs. Is that right?
Yes. So you'll be able to sit with it for a while.
Okay. Thank you. Hey, thanks to both of y'all. It looked like it took a lot of work. It looked like to me you covered about everything too.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, information items, we'll move down to C. It's a scenario for roadway safety performance targets, and I'm going to carry it back to Sean.
Thank you, Mayor Vogel. We've talked about the safety performance targets over the past month, I think, and today we wanted to present the results of the survey that we worked with our transportation partners on, TCC and TPB numbers, and provide a recommendation for setting roadway safety performance targets as part of the update of our regional transportation plan. So kind of tying this back to the goal weights, given that we've identified safety as our top priority, I think this is a very relevant discussion, which starts to provide us an opportunity to really specify what our desired outcome is for improving safety and really fleshing out that objective of reducing traffic fatalities within our region. As you have heard us reiterate in the past, as part of our performance-based planning process, there is a national goal to achieve a significant reduction in traffic fatalities and serious injuries on all public roads. And annually, we've adopted targets, safety targets for the 5 different measures as part of our performance-based planning requirements. And thus far, we've supported the state's targets, and but we, with the idea of developing regional targets as part of the 2045 regional transportation plan, for several reasons. One, to provide us an opportunity to be more ambitious in setting our targets in the direction of reducing fatalities, but also gives us an opportunity to think more long-term, out to the life of the transportation plan, 25 years. And so what we've highlighted last month as well is just to clarify what is the impact if the targets are not met, and because the FHWA doesn't assess the impact towards regional targets, there wouldn't be any impact on the MPO. State targets for safety are not, if they're not met, then TDOT will be not permitted to flex any of their safety funds on other project types, and will be required to obligate that HSIP, Highway Safety Improvement Program money, to solely safety projects. But I think that what we have identified through these scenarios, and I'll give a quick overview of those scenarios that we've identified specifically for the performance measure of traffic fatalities, the number of traffic fatalities for your consideration. And so those that we've identified and compiled in the survey for your feedback were 4 considerations. One would be to cap fatalities and not exceed the baseline or the current baseline of 197 traffic fatalities annually. Number 2 was a 1% annual reduction and that was a annual compounding 1% out to 2045. Third was a 50% overall reduction by 2045, which was a 50% overall decrease. And then the last, number 4, was a vision zero scenario of a 16% annual decrease compounding out to 2045. And so through the survey results, the first question that we raised to folks was, do you support the state or regional targets? And there was support for setting our own regional targets. And then when it came to the preference for which scenario within the regional targets, there wasn't a clear favorite, and so there was a lot of support, a lot of first place votes for scenario 1, capping fatalities, the scenario 2 for the 1% annual reduction, and as well as a number of first place votes for the vision zero scenario. But you can see that there was a lot of varying opinion across these. And so what we did is we took the weighted score based on the results, and then we identified here the number of first place votes that each of the target scenarios got, and then the number of last place votes. And as you can see, there, as I mentioned, a number of scenarios got a number of first place votes. And there was also some that got a number of last place votes, a high number of last place votes. And so, based on what we have seen with the weighted score, as well as the which scenario is, seems to have more consensus with the board and the TCC committee, is that staff would be recommending the 1% annual reduction, which, as a overall reduction, it's about a 23% overall reduction out to 2045. And that would be for specifically for traffic fatalities. And we could continue to build this out for the other safety performance measures as well. But today we just wanted to present this to you and get any initial feedback. We are not seeking any action today, but I think we would be looking for your support to continue to move forward with this as a regional target as we finalize the transportation plan, and as our annual adoption of safety performance targets is typically in February, and so we would be looking for this to really guide those future adoption of safety targets.
Okay, thank you, Sean. It's important to fill out these surveys, I see, because of what our influence we've got with maybe with TDOT, where the money goes. And I think these fatality deals are very serious, and I appreciate all the mayors participating in it. And anybody got any questions for Sean before we move on? Hearing none, we'll go for our regular reports.
Hey, I'm sorry. I was trying to keep from bothering you because I was going to send you this. I called Corky Cross, which is my State Farm agent.
Okay, we ready to go now? All right, we'll go to our regular reports. Our FHWA FTA report. Recognize Pam Gordon-Brock.
Thank you, Mayor Vogel. Just wanted to offer a couple of thoughts. Let me turn my video on. Good morning, everybody. The FAST Act, which is the authorization for federal funding, is going to expire in 2 weeks on September 30th. And as of today, there's been no action to reauthorize that. We're more than likely at this late date looking at a continuing resolution of some sort. However, Congress might take an action between now and October 1st to provide more longer term funding. But as we learn and get more guidance on what's happening, we will certainly let everybody know, and we will share this information with all the MPOs and with the state DOT. But keep an eye out on the news. We might hear at the same time. So we're continuing to work with the MPO and TDOT staff on the CMP update. We're participating, actually we're not holding, we're anticipating participating in a progress meeting with the MPO at the end of September. Look forward to continuing discussions on how the data analyses and the information that we saw previously is going to be incorporated into evaluation and prioritization, and then how that information is going to impact scope changes, and how that information is going to be brought back to the members for further project development. And then we appreciate the MPO and the previous presentation by Sean Falzer looking at safety targets for the region. And we're looking to see how the MPO is going to incorporate those specific targets into evaluation and prioritization, because it will have an impact on moving those safety numbers. So thank you, and we appreciate the virtual meetings continuing at least through the end of the month. I believe the governor's taking month-by-month decisions on this, but it certainly allows the public to participate and for us to continue to do the business that we have been tasked to do. So with that, I'll take any questions, and thank you for the opportunity to address the board.
Any question for Ms. Gordon-Brock? I've got one.
Yes, sir.
Is that your wallpaper or where you at?
No, it's my wallpaper, but it wouldn't be horrible to be on the beach right now, Mr. Mayor. But no, it's my wallpaper.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else got a question? If not, we'll move on to our TDOT report.
Thank you.
Preston, thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. Just have a few little updates here. I think last couple meetings I've mentioned that we have several grant opportunities out there. One is our 2021 Transportation Alternatives Program. Applications are due by October 2nd. The funding on that is an 80% federal, 20% local. Thank you, Sean. And the other one, which is already closed, but will be moving into the next phase of it, is our 2021 Multimodal Access Grant Program. And just to kind of give you an update, we received about 80 letters of intent to submit full proposals across the state. And notices will be going out shortly for those to submit full applications. And this is to provide sidewalk and bikeway improvements along state routes. And it's 95% state and 5% local. Another effort I just want to kind of mention is the statewide active transportation plan. I think your staff has been involved in this, and some of you in the community have as well. This is essentially an update to the state's bicycle and pedestrian plan. And we currently have ongoing what we're calling a virtual open house. And it's now between now and the October 7th. And I'll drop in the chat box the link that you can have an opportunity to view a video, and then also participate in the online survey, as well as a map where you can provide comments, point-specific comments. And again, this is an effort that, if you want to share within your communities, would be great, because it impacts the policies and decisions that the department looks at as it relates to providing walking and biking accommodations across the state. Lastly, a study effort that's kind of ongoing, but we haven't set the next round of engagement yet, is our I-40/81 corridor study. And this was an effort that was undertaken probably about 12 years ago. And this is an update to that. And it's looking at the I-40 corridor from Memphis all the way through Knoxville into North Carolina, and then the segment of 81 that goes up into Virginia. And I know that their staff has participated in that, and we'll be announcing some additional public virtual meetings coming up between now and the end of the year. The last information I have is we have just announced our new long-range planning director, who will be starting next month. And I think the announcement is very fitting here, because it's a person that once, or well, I should say twice, worked for the Nashville MPO, and that is Matt Meservey. And so he'll be starting later on in October. and we're glad to have him joining us, and look forward to getting him onto your MPO agendas as well. And Mayor, I think that's it for the updates from TDOT.
Okay, has anybody got any questions for Preston?
Mayor Vogel, I would like to make one
Yeah.
observation, if I can.
Yes, go
This is
ahead.
Mayor Hutto. Okay. The Pam is from Wilson County, and that's the view in Wilson County all over the place. And just wanted to kind of bring that to everybody's knowledge.
Well,
It's always beautiful in Wilson County, Mayor.
That's what I was thinking.
hey,
Sorry to interrupt.
well, when I first seen it, I thought she was on the beach. I really did, because her hair was blowing. I said, that's got to be a picture on the beach. But a lot of the beaches I saw on news this morning, it wouldn't have been that nice. Hey, thank you, Mayor Hutto, and thank you, Preston. I got a little chair's report that I need to do. If you bear with me, I'm gonna have to read most of it. But it says, be reminded the annual business meeting of the Greater National Regional Council is scheduled for next Wednesday, September 23rd at 10:30. This is a meeting of the full 93-member council body, which includes all city and county mayors across the 13-county footprint of the GNRC. The council will be electing officers, so you need to be on if you don't want to get elected. Certifies executive board adopting GNRC's annual work program and budget. And this work program incorporates the MPO program, which supports the Transportation Policy Board. I encourage each of you to participate in this online meeting. Details and agenda, the packet will be distributed by the staff later today, but it's also going to be available online at gnrc.org calendar. Okay, we're moving on to the staff report. Sean, you got anything you got for us?
I just want to thank everybody for sticking with us through the long meeting today, and just plug the September 30th again is when we're targeting this second workshop to put together a lot of the presentation materials and decisions that you made today. So look forward to that, and we'll get an invite out by the end of the week.
Okay, thank you, Sean. Any other bids needs to be brought up before the board? If not, I'd like to say thank you for the staff for helping me get ready with this. I didn't know Mayor Reed was going to have to give a speech. I expect she's going to be giving a lot of them in the future. And I miss seeing everybody. Wednesdays, getting to go to Nashville and seeing everybody and visiting with everybody, it means a whole lot to me. It's one of the special moments of being a Robertson County mayor. I miss seeing you all, but this will pass and we'll be together again. I want to thank everybody for taking time out to be on this meeting today, because it was important. And I'm going to ask you to stay safe. And I got one more motion I'm looking for. Motion to adjourn. Mayor Hutto, you still there?
Move for adjournment.
Okay, thank you. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Okay. Aye. Well, I'm gonna ask for a nay just in case somebody didn't get in. Okay, this meeting is adjourned. Thank y'all.